Chapter 8. The Unsinkable Women. In the boats, the world shrank to wood, breath, and a blackness so total it felt like pressure. No chandeliers, no carpets, no staircase to persuade the night into manners only, gunwales pale as bones, oars that bit water like teeth, and faces turned to listen for a rescue that had not yet learned their names. The small republic of a lifeboat. Boat no. 6. Drifted at first, oars shipped, shock kind of weather. Then, a voice refused the drift. Rolf. Margaret Brown, wealthy, yes, ornamental, no leaned into command without apology. She had a hatpin like a lance, and a temper that organized itself into verbs. When a sailor grumbled that women couldn't row, she answered with a stroke that rattled the thole and a look that settled the question. Blankets were redistributed. A child was pulled deeper into wool. A woman who could not stop shaking found her hands threaded into motion along an oar, her fear trained into work. In this boat, titles washed away as completely as footprints on the well deck. Countess, chambermaid, governess, cook, pulled even by the same cold, held up by the same stubborn wood. The only rank that mattered was courage, and even that came and went in waves. The education of hands. Rowing is a language taught by blisters. The first strokes are noisy, oars banging the gunwales with the gracelessness of panic. Then rhythm arrived, a mercy disguised as necessity. Dip, pull, feather, forward. Breath found a meter. Shoulders learned the economy of endurance. Sweat came, ridiculous in that cold, and froze along hairlines like a crown no one wanted. They turned the boat's nose toward a star the sailors swore would keep them oriented. Heaven finally earned its keep. Behind them, where the ship had been, the dark felt thicker, as if memory had weight. No one spoke of the sound that had finally dwindled. When someone began to cry, the others pretended to fuss with an oarlock until the wind felt louder again. Leadership refuses to apologize. Keep rowing. Margaret said, not because distance could be gobbled quickly, but because motion was a pronoun we and stillness a pronoun I. She took inventory without drama. Who's injured? Who's ill? Who can spell the sailor at the tiller? Who can sing a tune that makes time behave? She argued for turning back when they heard voices. The sailor, hard with experience, argued against it. Risk of swamping, risk of capsizing, risk of dying all at once instead of one by one. It is easy, warm, and a century later to declare what the moral arithmetic should have been. In that night, with that cold poised like a blade, choices were made with hands that could no longer feel the oars. Put judgment gently back in its sheath. Keep rowing. Class dissolves into usefulness. Elsewhere on the starlit black, Boat 8, Boat 5, Boat 7 little parentheses in the Atlantic sentence learned similar lessons. The countess who had memorized menus now learned knots. The seamstress who had stitched 1,000 hems found herself stitching a woman back into herself with a voice steady as a needle. A nurse, fingers stiff, felt for a pulse she could not quite command there, faint as the memory of a fireplace. A maid took a child who did not belong to her and made belonging irrelevant. "There now," she said. "There now," as if those words were the oars, and the oars the charm. An officer's pistol lay heavy in one boat, his orders heavier: hold station, don't drift too far, don't founder through compassion. He sat as upright as an oath, and stared at the eastern horizon, as if staring were a summons. Boat D, a ledger kept human. In one of the last boats to leave, the arithmetic had been crueler. Men who had shepherded others over the rail now found themselves without a place to stand that wasn't water. A stewardess' hands reddened from an hour of lifebelts and goodbyes climbed down a rope like laundry on a Monday and landed in a future she hadn't asked for. She led a little chorus of small, practical comforts: button that, tuck this, hat over ears, blanket around feet. The actions calmed the children, and, with the suspicious efficiency of maternal magic, the adults as well. Grief was there, seated aft, its face turned away, waiting for its moment. The crewman at the tiller voice, trained to the pitch of orders, kept it distracted with geometry, quarter points, stars as bearings, the discipline of not looking back. The sea's curriculum vitae. The Atlantic listed its credentials without speaking. 28 degrees south, pain, then numbness, then silence. Wind, light, almost tender, until you realize tenderness is a lie told by air that steals heat faster than language can keep up. Waves, modest, cooperative, only high enough to slap the boat when pride rose above sense. Stars, appalling in their abundance. Every so often, a piece of wreckage drifted past a chair defiant as a throne, a door that had gotten the wrong promotion, a corked bottle that owed its buoyancy to a tree that never imagined this duty. Someone reached toward one of these reliquaries and was stopped. Hands must be kept for oars. The inventory of keeping someone alive. Here is what survival looked like in the boats: rubbing a stranger's hands between your own until feeling reported for duty, trading hats like contraband, swapping places on the thwart so the smallest sat furthest from the wind, arguing with the universe, in a whisper, so the child on your lap wouldn't hear your theology fray. Breaking biscuits with the solemnity of sacrament. Emptying a bailer with the rhythm of prayer. Listening, always, for an engine that wasn't there. Swallowing the panic that rose like a tide behind your ribs by counting stars, breaths, oar strokes, the knots in the rope at your feet. And the quiet heroism you will never see in moving pictures, a woman steadying the boat with her palm against the gunwale as someone retched miserably over the side and returned pale, embarrassed, still alive. The arguments of conscience. Aft in one boat, a quarrel sharpened like a knife. Forward, it was blunted by fatigue. To return or to hold off, this was the split that will draw commentary forever. The officer chose distance. Margaret chose outrage. The sailors chose seamanship. The night chose quiet. And, in the disagreement, the boat found a strange equilibrium. Anger is warm. It kept some from slipping into the soft, fatal courtesy of sleep. Later, much later, when the decks of the rescue ship were underfoot and hindsight had its stomach full, words would be flung like crockery. Tonight, choices were oars, and the future a line you could only approach. A lullaby made of orders. Feather, feather your oars. Keep together. Head to that star. Breathe, love. Breathe with me. Change places, careful there. We'll see lights any moment. Any moment now. Instructions became lullabies. Lullabies became orders. And between them, the boats kept to their small republics, their governments of the necessary and the kind. The horizon thinks about it. Somewhere beyond the curve of the world, a steam whistle answered the wireless. The Carpathia, called out of her own narrative, had turned and was running into a night so cold the crew wrapped scarves around their orders. Captain Rostron, who will be given fewer pages in schoolbooks than he deserves, stacked miracles. Lifeboats swung out, gangways rigged, stewpots lit, blankets gathered, doctors roused, bulkheads lit, engines pressed hard without bursting pride into ruin. He prayed, then did the work prayer requires. Back on the boats, no one knew his name yet. They knew only that the air felt slightly less empty when they listened hard enough. The other kind of courage. In one boat, a woman began to sing. Not loudly, not bravely, the kind of singing you do when you need to wallpaper terror with something you can make yourself. Others joined because harmony is a kind of heat. The song was not a hymn or a popular tune, something plain, probably about a river or a home with a kitchen, the sort of melody that tells the body it still belongs somewhere. A child fell asleep to it, and someone cried with relief so quietly no one had to pretend not to notice. The night holds, then loosens. Hours do the opposite of what they do ashore. They lengthen until a minute can contain a marriage and a life story. They shorten until a lifetime is a single oar stroke done properly. The eastern sky considered its contract and, reluctantly, began paying installments of gray. Faces reassembled out of the dark. The boats discovered one another, outlines becoming company. Voices called names that belonged to no one present and were answered by silence as gentle as a refusal. A gull appeared, idiotically cheerful, and reminded everyone that the world persists. The first impossible light. Their far-off lamp glow, climbing slowly up the night's underskirt. A masthead star that moved wrong. Then the shape under it, a ship, dark except for the lights ordered, lit for you. Some prayed, without noticing. Some swore with the devotion of saints. Some, unbelievably, fussed about hair. Do not mock them. Dignity is a raft that floats, too. Flares went up from the Carpathia, signals snipping the last threads of doubt. Oars bit water with the eagerness of dogs pulling a sled within sight of home. A sailor who had been 40 for an hour became 20 again. The ladder that hurts and saves. The rescue ship loomed, a cliff of iron that meant morning. Ropes unfurled. Nets dropped. Ladders rattled themselves into kindness. The first hand on the first rung found it terribly far. Arms reached so many arms, hauling the cold, the stunned, the stubbornly alive up and over, into light and steam, and the annoying wealth of air that didn't hurt to breathe. Names began to be asked and written. Names began to fail and be replaced by descriptions. The woman with the blue shawl. The boy with the cap. The one who kept the oar. Tea acquired the rank of miracle. Blankets became geography. A doctor pressed fingers to pulses and ordered broth like a general who understood victory. Margaret Brown, boots wet, voice hoarse, took up a new fight with the assurance of someone who has already won one tonight. Rooms, clothing, lists, collections for the steerage women. Arguments with any officer who mistook rank for authority over need. She was not unsinkable. She was furious in the service of the living, which is better. Reckoning, postponed. On the Carpathia's decks, survivors looked where the horizon had failed to return a ship, and learned the first shape of their grief. Some asked for husbands and were answered by silence that wore a uniform. Some looked for children and found them, and the world spun back onto its axis for a few merciful seconds. Some began sentences that had no verbs large enough. The captain of the rescue ship turned his bow toward New York and made speed, the sea yielding in long gray sighs. Behind, under 2 miles of water, a new geography had been added to the Atlantic without ceremony. But do not let the silence swallow what the boats accomplished. In those hours when the night practiced cruelty, women rowed, argued, organized, sang, and kept breath moving. They did not wait to be saved into heroism. They manufactured it. Chapter 9. The Final Hour. There's a sound steel makes when it remembers it was once oar low, animal, surprised to find itself asked to be earth again. In the last hour, the ship learned that sound. Lights burned steady, then stuttered. The bow kept sinking with the quiet focus of work well done, and the stern began to lift, not dramatically at first, but enough that feet felt like secrets trying to slide out of shoes. Gravity rewrites the etiquette. Tables became hills, carpets became slopes, handrails, religion. The angle underfoot edited posture, men in evening dress going to hands and knees without irony. Stewards bracing themselves to knot a scarf around someone's ears, children clutching the balustrade as if it were a tame tree in a storm. The ship had always been a choreography. Now it was a scramble scored in breath and brass. Above, funnels drew lines against a hard starfield, the first one leaning like a tired man before it let go, a thunderclap of falling iron, a wind punch from the air that tore lifeboats and sent spray up the deck like applause no one wanted. People ducked, flinched, held on. A woman's hat skimmed away into the dark like a small moon losing patience. The band's stubborn hour. They played past good sense. Not to be noble on purpose, just because order was contagious when rendered in melody. Hands numbing, strings colder than bone, they stayed with the work. Waltz to hymn to something barely remembered, a tune that fitted the pattern of the crowd's heartbeats. It does not matter which was the last. What mattered, the music outlived a dozen lesser courages, gave language to breath, made time, if not kind, at least legible. Below, the last arguer with water. Deep in the bright hot world where valves gleamed like summer fruit, engineers nursed pumps that had no intention of surrendering until physics forced their resignation. Steam gauges trembled. The floor learned to tilt. Shoes became decisions. A man put his palm to a pipe and nodded still warm and moved on. They were not martyrs by design. They were professionals who believed in their craft, and their craft required minutes. Those minutes climbed ladders, found ropes, became seats in boats, became pages in letters no one had posted, became names still living. The desk that wouldn't leave its duty. Jack Phillips, eyes gritty, fingers stiff, kept tapping. CQD, SOS, positions confirmed. A drumbeat of dots and dashes punched into a night that could not be bothered. Harold Bride pulled on boots that would soon taste salt and listened, teeth set. A reply, then another, Carpathia coming hard. He folded the fact like a blanket around his fatigue and went on. We praise heroism that charges. Remember also the heroism that sits and taps and refuses to stand up before the job is done. The last boats, the last bargains. On the boat deck, canvas crumpled, ropes burned palms, and orders came in sentences short enough to survive the angle. In you go. Hold fast. Lower away. Revolvers barked authority when words wore out. A few men tried to climb in and were returned to the deck by hands that no longer recognized class. A few were told to step in and shook their heads, husbands, stoked with the painful dignity of staying, crew whose duty weighed more than survival. Margaret Brown, voice hoarse, temper intact, shouted one more woman into safety and turned away only when the boat was a shape falling out of reach. The deck becomes a cliff. At the bow, water curled over railings like a rumor becoming policy. The name on the prow vanished without ceremony. A great anchor chain sang as it met the sea. The list sharpened, the stern lifted. People moved toward the upward end because hope and gravity agreed for once. On the poop deck there was a terrible kind of calm, stars overhead, night air like glass, and underfoot a slope that asked for measured steps. Some prayed without words, some wordlessly remembered faces, some simply adjusted their hat because dignity is a raft even here. A young stewardess buttoned a man's coat as if he had a train to catch. The break. It didn't happen like in the loud stories. It happened like a limb asked to bear the wrong load. The ship arched, the steel complained. A seam of failure ran like lightning through the spine. A groan you could feel more than hear, then a crack that snapped the night. Between the third and fourth funnels, the ship tore. The bow, heavy, plummeted. The stern dropped again onto the sea with a shudder that shook lungs. Then the stern, lightened of everything forward, lifted steeper, steeper, until the deck was a wall, and people clung like punctuation on the last line of a page. A pianist's stool slid past and vanished. A chair, admired by a duke, found itself briefly airborne, then obedient to salt law. The vertical world. Now the ship pointed at the stars. The propellers cleared the water, black discs against black. Windows flickered, rallied, died. Those who remained gripped railings and ladders, any seam of metal their fingers could remember. A man spoke aloud to himself, not a prayer, more like an agreement. All right then. Another laughed once, short and tender, at his own absurd continued existence. Baker Charles Jowan, pockets full of stubbornness and the kind of liquid courage that slows panic, moved along the rail, tossing chairs over to make rafts out of furniture because practical men think like that, even in nonsense. He wedged himself at the very stern, high as a bell ringer, and waited for the ocean to finish writing its sentence. The plunge and the silence. The final glide was not a plunge, but a surrender, stern standing, a pause, a long, helpless inhale, then a slide. Water met wood, iron met cold, sound rose not a scream alone, a chorus of breaking, rushing, human voices braided with physics, then collapsed, inward, muffled, immense. The ocean closed its mouth. In the boats, oars hesitated. The survivors looked at the place where light had been and found nothing to focus on but stars and the shape of each other's breath. Someone said, "She's gone," as if the ocean needed a witness. Then came the other sound, the one you do not forget, even in sleep, voices on the water. Not many, more than enough. calls that began as questions and turned into air. The boats held off as ordered. One or two turned back as conscience insisted. The cold was not dramatic. It was efficient. Joffin surfaced, surprised to find breath, surprised also to find his limbs reporting for duty in water that had fired everyone else. He found wreckage, then a collapsible boat upturned. He climbed, balanced, slid, clung, existed. When memory later tried to gild him with magic, he would shrug and give credit to luck and warmth in the belly. He was not a fable. He was a baker who refused the obvious. The numbers begin to exist. What follows is always arithmetic. Boats counted boats. Officers read faces and wrote names into lists, pencils tearing softened paper. The night opened its fist a little toward the east and put gray in the air. Survivors saw each other fully for the first time, ash-streaked, salt-slick, eyes like lanterns turned down to save oil. In the near distance, a rocket lifted Carpathia, telling the horizon what it intended to be. The last acts of the lost. There is no romance in this part, only the human insistence on meaning. A man in the water pushed another piece of wreckage towards someone smaller. A woman hauled a child, no one's child, everyone's child, over a gunwale with a grunt that sounded like a lifetime. A crewman in a boat sang horribly out of tune because the silence was worse. An officer kept count in a voice that cracked. A mother stared at her empty lap and rocked anyway, as if the motion could conjure weight. Above all, breath. In and out, thin, precious, defiant. The ocean had taken what it wanted. The remainder belonged to those who could keep counting. The captain, the designer, the myths we choose. Was Smith last seen at the bridge, still and proper, as the water climbed his boots? Was he elsewhere, quiet, ending a long conversation with the sea he'd served? Accounts disagree. The ocean is a poor stenographer. People will decide according to their needs and call it history. Thomas Andrews. A steward swore he saw him standing in the first-class smoking room without a hat, staring at a painting as if framing one last correction in his mind. Another swore he watched him help with lifebelts to the very last. The stories agree on this, he kept instructing. Teachers teach even when the school burns. It is tempting to demand the clean line of a moral. Better to keep the messy truth. Death is not a referendum on worth. Courage does not guarantee survival, nor cowardice doom. The sea is not a judge, it's a fact. What the last hour left behind. A few planks. A field of stars reflected in black water until the sky seemed to have fallen and learned to float. The faint glow of a ship running toward you with intentions visible in every bulb. Salt on lips. Splinters in hands. Names beginning to detach from faces, already migrating into lists, carved later in stone. And a silence you could walk on, until oars bit it into ripples and turned it back into water. We will not put a bow on it. The bow is under 2 miles of Atlantic now, resting at an angle memory cannot hold steady. What we will do is follow the boats toward the flare, toward blankets and broth, toward the decks where grief will learn to stand upright without toppling over, toward the wire that will carry news to a world that thought itself too modern for this. Chapter 10. The aftermath, Carpathia and the ghosts. Dawn bleeds into the Atlantic like someone finally turned up the lamp. The sea is pewter, the cold a law, the boat's small commas on a page still mostly blank. And then there's smoke where no cloud should be, a masthead star that moves, the black flank of a ship carrying light like a promise. A captain who runs toward night. On the Carpathia, Captain Arthur Rostron had already built a miracle out of minutes. Woken by the Titanic's wireless coordinates punched into darkness, he made a decision that felt like a vow. Engines to full. All hands called. Stewards to blankets. Stew pots lit. Ladders rigged, nets unfurled, swing booms cleared. Lifeboats manned and ready to drop. Doctors roused, surgery laid out. Electric lights lit along the ship's flank like a runway for the lost. He did one more thing, he prayed. Then he did the work prayer demands. The ship ran through fields of ice, in a blackness that had reasons to refuse him. She didn't. The ladder that hurts and saves. The first boat scraped along Carpathia's side with the complaint of wood against iron. Voices rose in officers' orders, a child trying not to cry, a woman coughing sea salt out of her lungs. Ropes snaked down. Nets fell open. The sheer of the hull made the climb a vertical biography, birth into hands, renaming, renumbering, breath turning from knife to air. A sailor reached down with the tenderness of a midwife. A nurse's face appeared above the rail, hair loose, eyes professional. A deck became geography, this way to warmth, this way to tea, this way to a chair that is the opposite of water. The rescued came aboard in every possible state, stunned, shivering, organized, undone. A boy with a cap too big. A woman with a shawl too thin. A baby wrapped in a coat that smelled of another life. Names were asked. Names faltered. The purser began a list anyway. Female, blue shawl, male, fair hair, child, asleep. It mattered to write something. The world insists on nouns when the sea has offered pronouns. A republic of blankets. Carpathia turned herself into a floating hospital and a sudden city hall. Blankets became borders. Tea became sacrament. Broth became a form of speech that comfort understands better than words. The dining saloon, still set for a breakfast that could not be eaten, filled with bodies rediscovering heat. Stewards buttoned coats on shoulders that had mistaken shaking for identity. A doctor pressed fingers to a wrist and nodded, "There you are, stay." Margaret Brown climbed a new staircase of usefulness without catching her breath. She bullied the wealthy into generosity and the shy into accepting it. Clothes were collected, money counted, children tallied. She argued with officers who mistook standing orders for commandments, and won without gloating. If grief had a foreman, it was her. Somewhere in the bustle, a man stared at his empty hands, as if the ocean had stolen the shape of what they were meant to hold. A girl asked if the stars would follow them to New York and was told yes, because kindness prefers lies that heal. A wire that stitches the world. In Carpathia's wireless room, the future hammered itself into sequence. Harold Cottam, who had heard Titanic's call and roused his ship, now became a stenographer to history. Beside him, Titanic's junior operator Harold Bride, rescued with feet numb and duty intact, sat with his headphones crooked, bandaged and stubborn, helping send lists, physicians, the captain's notes, the words that would travel faster than steam ever had. Messages leapt to Cape Race, and from there to the world. Survivors aboard Carpathia. Titanic founders after collision with ice. A planet that it had thought itself too modern for this sharpened like a gasp. On deck, someone asked if the messages would find their family. Yes, a steward said. We will make certain of it. It was not a promise he could guarantee, but promises were architecture now. The inventory of loss, written slowly. All morning and into afternoon, boats were found, hailed, hauled in. Names were taken and retaken, spellings corralled, accents translated into letters. The roll grew, a rough ledger against the ocean's thoroughness. It became clear what could not be admitted as rumor. More than 1,000 souls had not come over the rail. Grief arrived in private, then in public. A woman asked for her husband, and the question made the air colder. A child slept through his mother's tears because the body sometimes has better manners than the mind. An officer stared at his hands and found them still shaking even when they were empty. A stewardess, cheeks chapped with salt and wind, poured tea with a steadiness that told the watching she would not cry until the pot was empty. Carpathia's crew lined the rail, scanning for life long after the arithmetic had taken on its final tone. The man who could not hide. At some point, Bruce Ismay, chairman of the White Star Line, stood on the rescue ship's deck and discovered that survival can be a sentence. He had taken a place in a lifeboat, law number 1. Judgment always arrives in the wrong tense, and now reporters would later sharpen their pens on his name until it squeaked. On Carpathia, he did not preen, he shrank. He helped where told. He avoided eyes because each eye was a verdict. We like villains. We should be careful with them. The ocean does not offer tidy casting. A captain who keeps choosing. Rostron ran his ship through ice like a man late for a good deed. He posted extra lookouts, doubled watches, set the ship to thread among bergs with the slow arrogance of care. He ordered Sunday service on Monday. The crew and the saved gathered under a sky newly rued with daylight prayers said for the lost, hymns that tried to learn the shape of mourning on such short notice. For those in peril on the sea, voices sang, and the sea, which does not answer, nevertheless felt spoken to. He turned his bow toward New York. There had been talk of Halifax, of other ports. No. New York was where the promised letters were waiting. New York was the city to which the lives on board were already addressed. New York, assembling silence. By the time Carpathia's masthead was sighted, New York had become a waiting room. Crowds jammed the White Star offices. Chalkboards were hung. Names written, erased, corrected, rewritten. A man with a piece of chalk became a priest, his hand a metronome for hope and despair. Police held lines that no one dared riot against. Grief had undone even violence. Newspapers ran extra after extra, columns filling with contradictions. Telegraph boys knocked at doors like reluctant executioners. Hotels prepared rooms that would not be slept in. The Cunard Pier, Pier 54, lit itself like an altar. Reporters swarmed the Hudson in hired tugs, Photographers oiled their shutters. The city, expert at welcome, was clumsy with condolence. The arrival that wasn't. Night cloaked the river when Carpathia finally shouldered past the Statue of Liberty, an irony whose hands no one had the energy to wave at, and made for the pier. It was raining, a delicate mercy. Rain makes tears look like weather. As the ship came alongside, the crowd did not cheer. It inhaled. On deck, survivors saw a continent of faces climb toward them like a tide. Some faces were strangers, some, suddenly, were not. Arms gestured, unintelligible and perfect here, here, here. As if bodies could summon loved ones up a gangway by semaphore. Gangplanks dropped. Officers formed corridors. The first carried off were the injured, the children, those whose steadiness had run out. Blankets moved like woolen ghosts. A priest blessed. A nurse read a name aloud and watched a woman fold around it as around a blade. Then came the little rituals of rescue, a tag tied to a buttonhole with a destination written in a neat hand, a cup set in fingers that did not quite remember how to hold, a question asked softly, "Is there anyone you must send word to?" And a pencil presented like a wand. Lists screamed quietly. Inside the pier shed, chalkboards continued their cruel arithmetic. Names of the saved under the day's date, names of the missing under a silence. People searched letters as if looking for the start of a miracle. Some found it. Some did not. The boards received their tears like weathered slate receives rain, without protest, without change. Margaret Brown didn't stop. She pushed past reporters to deposit cash, where it turned into rooms and clothes. She scolded an official who tried to send steerage women to a charity bureau before to a hot bath. She had no patience left for embarrassment. Embarrassment is a luxury starved by catastrophe. Ismay was ushered away under guard, not for his safety only, but for the city's. He vanished into convalescence and a version of history that would never forgive him entirely, however careful an inquiry might be later with facts. The newspapers invent a new verb to Titanic. Morning after morning, headlines learned new shapes. Inquiry demanded. Ice warnings ignored. Heroes of the wireless. Women and children first. Editorials inflated, deflated, accused forgave. Photographs showed hats bowed against rain. Lifeboats swung from Carpathia's davits, a pile of selvage deck chairs that looked indecently comfortable. The word unsinkable became a joke that no one laughed at. The word modern had its collar loosened by grief. Telegrams cracked into 1,000 households with black lightning. Some families lit candles. Some stared at chairs. Some went immediately, almost angrily, to their closets to pack clothes for the living who would need them. We talk about shock as immobility. Often it is busyness, hands bewildered, but not idle. The legal theater begins its rehearsal. Before the salt had dried, subpoenas sprouted. In Washington, Senator William Alden Smith prepared a hearing room with chairs hard enough for contrition. In London, the Board of Trade made ready its own stage. Officers would be sworn. Blueprints would be unrolled like maps of a lost country. Testimony would be taken down in rows of rectangles stacked like lifeboats in a margin. Blame would be sought, which is to say, story would be tamed into cause and effect, palatable enough for policy. Not yet, though. Tonight belongs to the rescued and to the city that tried to hold them at once. The ghosts disembark last. On decks now empty of boats, rope tails swayed and knocked wood with a sound like a lazy metronome. In the water, the shape where a ship should have been persisted in the imagination until sleep unstitched it. In the pier shed, a blanket left behind held the shape of a body and then did not. A boy woke in a hotel room and panicked because quiet no longer sounded like safety. A woman dreamed of a staircase and woke with an ache in her hand where a railing had been. A baker sat at last before a bowl of stew, found he could not make his mouth believe in spoons. A stewardess folded her borrowed clothes as if she might be asked to account for their creases. Grief came in waves, not synchronized with the rivers. It washed people up on their own lives at uneasy angles. The miracle of rescue did not cancel the arithmetic. It simply wrote a different equation for the living. The city exhales, the world inhales. When the rain paused, streets made room for processions of cabs, ambulances, angels in aprons, men carrying umbrellas like banners, women with shawls full of necessities. Hotels rang with careful knocks and careful voices. Churches opened their doors not with sermons, but with chairs and hot drinks and the knowledge of where to find a doctor who would not ask questions before offering warmth. The world, Paris, Buenos Aires, Calcutta, Melbourne, read of it all with a sudden intimacy. The Atlantic stopped being an elsewhere. It was now the middle of every map. A myth was born the way myths are, half facts, half the need to make facts mean. Unsinkable became a curse. Icebergs became villains, lifeboats saints, bands the liturgy of courage, and wireless operators the patron saints of the new century's conscience. Somewhere in the embroidery of that myth, the ordinary persisted, a spoon, a hat, a telegram, a list. And the wire keeps humming. Carpathia slipped from New York the next day, back to her schedules, carrying crew who had learned too much about night and survivors who had not yet learned how to sleep. The wireless hummed. Messages went out, arrived, alive, come quickly, forgive, and messages returned, thank God, stay, we are coming, we are here. The sea returned to its work of being larger than explanations. But something had changed. Safety drills would be ordered. Lifeboats would be counted by seats, not by tonnage. Ice patrols would prowl. Wireless would be manned at night. The world would sit up a little straighter when someone said the word unsinkable, and engineers would feel, thereafter, a small, useful ache when they reached for superlatives. None of that comforted the newly bereaved. Change never pays back debt. It only prevents future loans. The ghost that lingers. Walk the pier late after the last cab has gone. The floor smells of rope, rain, and tea. A single glove waits on a bench as if its owner might return and explain. Somewhere, clerk, finally alone, wipes the chalkboard clean and stares at the blankness as if it were a mercy and an insult. We leave the city here, its lights busy with the living, its windows dimmed for the lost. Ahead lies silence, measured in miles and years. Below, on a plain of black mud, a great ship settles into angles no architect ever drew. The world has put on mourning clothes and gone to work. The story, like the river, keeps moving. Chapter 11. The Wreck Beneath the Waves. There is a kind of darkness that isn't the absence of light, so much as the presence of pressure. 2.5 miles down, the Atlantic is not black, it is weight. It is time, condensed into water. Anything human that ventures here must bring its own daylight in bulbs the size of apples and the audacity of a lighthouse in a throat. For decades, the wreck was a rumor the ocean kept. Survivors had drawn pictures, navigators had logged coordinates, storytellers had given the ship a second life in words. But the hull itself lay in a cold, slow dream, unvisited, unphotographed, unjudged. The first half of the 20th century was too busy with its own disasters to hire the abyss as archivist. Then 1985 arrived with machines, and the rumor rolled over in sleep. Ghost hunting machines. Imagine a night on the surface that feels like the beginning of everything, an empty ocean above a crowded history. On deck, a handful of men and women in windbreakers and wool caps, coffee in paper cups, the smell of diesel and salt and the future. They lower into the sea, not a diver that would be a joke at this depth, but a robot with eyes tuned to midnight. Its name is Argo, and its job is to see without living. On the screens, gray, then grain, then not quite noise, that starts to resemble the language of the seabed ripples, like wind frozen on sand. A slope that isn't interested in being dramatic. Hours pass, measured in pings and muttered distances. Then junk. Not glamorous junk, contour lines of metal that recall nothing if you don't already know what to recall. A boiler. A plate. A something that used to be an edge. And then the bow rises into the monitors like a cathedral remembering its shape. You're on the deck with them, aren't you? You can hear the shout that turns into a hush because reverence has better instincts than triumph. A railing appears under the lights, familiar, indecently intact. The great anchor hawse holes gape like eyes. Silt drifts in slow snowfall. The ship you have rehearsed, the ship postcards had memorized, lifts out of darkness with a serenity that feels almost rude. She is broken, yes, her back torn, the stern scattered and feral, a tumble of steel and ribs, the debris field a long snowfall of dinner plates and stray shoes, but the bow is a presence that answers to its name. We say, discovered, as if the ocean were lost and someone found it. What we mean is, the ship was ready to be seen again, and humans came with lenses we could trust. The long corridor of water. Light from the submersible carves a cone into the dark. The beam makes silt snow, makes a forest of iron stringers grow, makes rivets gleam like constellations. You peer through Argo's eyes later, through a child sub named Jason Jr., and down a promenade that arithmetic once claimed indestructible. Doors gape. Glass is gone where pressure has decided that transparency requires absence. Those famous windows, eyebrows of an empire stare. If you are inclined to metaphors, you'll find them here. The grand staircase, that thesis in carved oak, has dissolved into a well. Its iron skeleton remains like the ghost of an argument. Above it, daylight used to pour in a confident, cultivated flood. Now the whole is full of sea and silence. Where honor and glory once crowned time, oxidized ornaments cling like barnacles to memory. But don't indulge too much. The abyss dislikes sentimentality unless it's honest. Look at what is still undeniably beautiful. Leaded glass, curled and sleeping. A chandelier, fallen and tangled. Beads, dulled and perfect. Like a dream the ocean agreed to hold politely. A bronze cherub smiles from the balustrade he no longer guards, his grin unchanged, his job description annihilated. Rust that eats like time. You expected clean ruin. The ocean prefers appetite. Along the steel, strange icicles grow rusticles. They are called as if the ship had sprouted winter under sea. They look delicate, candled. They are alive, collectively. A cathedral of bacteria building stalactites from steel the way coral makes cities out of hunger. Touch one, and it collapses in a cloud. Leave them, and they write their slow cursive down bulkheads. Time, time, time. If you are a romantic, this depresses you. The ship is vanishing, molecule by molecule, into the mineral speech of the deep. If you are a scientist, it fascinates you. Life in a zone we thought lifeless, feasting on our industry, teaching us humility in the shape of lace. People ask, how long? How long before the bow is soft and the stern a rumor? The numbers are guesses, wearing lab coats. What matters is not the expiry date, but the fact that nothing stays. The ocean is not a museum unless you count its silt as a display case for erosion. The debris field, a biography. Between bow and stern lies a nation scattered. Soup tureens sit as if the waiter has just stepped away. China plates rest in drifts, their white star burgee still crisp because glaze holds stubbornly to identity. Shoes. Always the shoes. Leather, tanned to fight bacteria, keeps the shape of feet that are elsewhere. A broken violin case. A bottle that will never again be used to apologize or to celebrate. A bronze telemotor from the bridge, dignified, even decapitated. The stern is chaos ripped open, decks folded, engines bared like the ribs of a giant creature that fought the water until the last claws of physics. Iron curls, broken cranes, a tangle of davits and pulleys that once obeyed the gentle grammar of boat lowering and now speak fluent ruin. Over all of it, the snow of the deep continues to fall, patient as an undertaker. The small sub crawls where memory walks. The first time a camera peered into the Marconi room, there was an indecent thrill. The key shelf, the bench, the ghosts of messages in the silt. In the Turkish bath, tile still dreams in patterns that promised a fantasy of health. A bedstead lies tilted in a stateroom, its brass still capable of taking a polish it will never receive again. A bathtub, yes, that bathtub wears rust like a shawl. You and I could make a list of relics. But be careful. This is a grave, some say. This is a site of science, others argue. This is salvage, says a third, with the economics of curiosity as logic and defense. The cameras do not vote. They record. The argument that will not surface. What do we owe the dead when the dead live under miles of pressure? The debate began the moment the first clear image reached a breakfast table. Expeditions multiplied, some commercial, some academic, some a hybrid of wonder and commerce, that makes certain stomachs sour. Artifacts were brought up, a deck chair, a whispering gallery of porcelain, a telegraph from the engine room whose pointer still indicates orders no one can obey. Exhibitions were mounted, curated like reliquaries. People filed past glass cases and found, to their surprise, that compassion can be awakened by a cup. On the other side of town, others wrote in careful letters and at microphone podiums, "Let her be. Let the Atlantic keep its dead in peace." They used words like sanctity. They were not wrong. The law struggled to keep up, as law does, a tangle of jurisdictions and claims, of courts labeling salvers and looters, as if the difference could be pinned cleanly without catching a finger. If you want me to settle it, I can't. A century on, Titanic remains a mirror. Your ethics will see themselves in her. So will mine. Perhaps that, too, is part of the wreck's power, to pull us into a conversation about reverence in an age that often confuses memory with content. The photograph that doesn't move. A single image from the late 20th century sits in my mind like a quiet bell, a pair of shoes on the seabed, toes touching. There is no body pressure made sure of that, but absence can be more articulate than presence. The shoes do not accuse. They only continue to point toward a person's shape, which we carry for them in imagination. If the museum exists anywhere, it exists in that act, the audience finishing the outline, the sea erased. Are we being morbid? Or merely honest about how humans make meaning out of silt? Microbes, myths, and mosaics. As the years turned, explorers returned with new tools. Photomosaics stitched thousands of frames into maps large enough to lay on a gymnasium floor. Sonar painted slopes and shadows. Revolved their tethers like umbilical cords, drifted through interiors too fragile for anything heavier than light. We learned the layout of collapse, the way one learns a stranger's house by feel at night. And we learned decay's grammar, the bow softening, plates opening like books whose spines have given up, the captain's bathtub still there, then less there, the wheelhouse roof collapsing, the mast slipping, the crow's nest's bell no longer where jokes expected to be. People asked, again, how long? Again, the ocean shrugged. The paradox of preservation. There's a word you hear on deck before a dive, stewardship. It tastes righteous and complicated at once. To document is to trespass. To leave alone is to abandon. To recover is to rescue. To recover is to rob. To show a child a cup and to see compassion climb into their face is to win an argument for empathy. To charge admission is to lose one for purity. Meanwhile, in the deep, no arguments, only accretion and appetite. Rusticles fatten and fall. Silt drifts and covers. Each expedition's lights wake a colony of shrimp that wheel like sparks through the beam and withdraw when the lantern swims away. The ship lies. Not indifferent objects don't have the equipment for indifference, but unconsulted. Sometimes I think this is what history really is, the unconsulted, arranged by the living into stories they can carry. A descent in second person. Let me take you down, just for a minute, as if the hatch shuts above your shoulders and the world becomes a sphere with glass for eyes. The sub hums, a small, busy insect. Pressure talks to the hull in low syllables you agree to ignore. The pilot watches sonar as if it were a fable. Beside him, a monitor snow, then seabed. You fall slowly until falling turns into hovering and hovering into approach. The bow arrives like a mountain that forgot to be land. You drift over the well deck. You see the capstans where chains once paid out cleanly. You skirt the break where Titanic became wreck, steel peeled, decks stacked, a cross-section of catastrophe. You can almost hear the groan that is no longer there. You nose along the starboard side, and the names on your tongue feel too loud in your head. Smith, Andrews, Murdoch, Phillips, Brown, Juckin. You stop saying them because the ocean insists on quiet here, and you obey. A porthole passes, a round eye. Inside, a stateroom wallpapered with bacteria and history. A jug turned on its side, handle intact. A chair that looks, absurdly, like sitting. Your lights flake rust off with brightness. You remember to turn them down not because the dead care, but because humility helps certain living behave better. You turn for home, ballast sloshing, batteries a liturgy. On the surface, the air tastes like laughter. It always does. Survival is drunk on oxygen. The living argue while the deep continues its work. In boardrooms and courtrooms, plans are pressed, no touch zones mapped, salvage rights asserted, research consortia formed. The phrase, in perpetuity, stamped on documents, as if paper could speak ocean. Television specials rehearse the discovery again, because discovery is the most human sport after survival. Museums fill and empty. Gift shops sell fragments of story pocket-sized and mostly harmless. The wreck sinks another few centimeters into mud. Some year, a storm message comes back from an expedition, deterioration accelerated here or there, bulkhead gone, roof collapsed, mast disarticulated. The public sighs the way people sigh when a landmark is demolished. Someone always arrives late to grief. Others, the ones who study these updates the way some study weather, feel the small, sorrowful satisfaction of being right about entropy. Why we keep going back? Why do we keep sending lights to visit this steel that is learning to be stone? Because we are incurable about our dead. Because technology gives us a way to feel that we are, at last, good at apologies. Because the cameras are also mirrors. Because every dive is a confession that progress did not save everyone in 1912 and will not save everyone tomorrow. Because under miles of water lies a story that organizes our arguments about hubris, care, class, luck, and the obligation of the competent to the surprised. Because, in the end, it is still beautiful, the bow, patient in the dark, the silt's slow snow, the chandelier asleep, the shoes that point toward a self our imagination completes, the eerie dignity of a city becoming geology, the etiquette of farewell. Here's how an honest expedition ends. The sub breaks the surface and flails its way back to the ship like a seal being bullied by gravity. Hatches open. The smell of coffee remembers you. The deck tilts forgivingly. Someone laughs too loudly. Someone cries privately, a corner where the wind won't mock them. The hard drives and the film canisters and the little bags with silt are carried carefully to a room that used to be a mess and is now an archive. Before they head for port, someone, perhaps the captain, perhaps the youngest on the roster, stands on the aft deck with their hands around a railing older than any of them and says nothing at all. That is the correct prayer. Up in the night, satellites move like careful punctuation across a sky that once ignored rockets in favor of stars. Down below, the wreck continues to become the ocean. And we continue to become the kind of creatures who tell stories not to tame the sea, but to remember that it is larger than we are. Chapter 12. The Dream That Wouldn't Die. There are ships that sail, and ships that dock, and ships that sink. And then there are ships that refuse to stay, only ships. Titanic did not end, it recurred. It surfaced again and again, in courtrooms and classrooms, in novels and night terrors, on cinema screens so large you could feel cold rising up your sleeves. When a story refuses burial, it means we still need what it's trying to say. The wake that kept rippling. First came rules, the sober, untheatrical kind, that do not fit easily onto memorial plaques, but save lives quietly. Lifeboats for all. Drills that drill. Wireless watched through the night. An international ice patrol to pace the North Atlantic like a shepherd. Each new regulation was a stitch in a wound. Engineers went home with a new superstition: never say unsinkable out loud. Executives learned a nervous respect for worst-case scenarios. Captains learned to mistrust glassy seas. And yet rules cannot do the work of elegy. Humans needed to narrate what the ocean had edited. The ink that remembered. The first wave of books arrived quickly: memoirs by survivors with hands still unsteady, pamphlets by moralists who found sermons in cold water, official inquiries bound in covers sturdy enough to survive a century of pointing fingers. The language was dignified, sometimes defensive, sometimes raw. A single sentence could contain a life. We lowered away. Another could pull a lifetime into parenthesis. He remained behind. We began, as we always do, to curate tragedy into something we could stand to carry. Then came Walter Lord's A Night to Remember, 1955, a book that moved like a camera before cameras could afford, the feet cutting from deck to deck, voice to voice, making mosaic feel like memory. It made room for the modest heroism we had overlooked, and the inconvenient coincidences we had oversimplified. If you've ever retold Titanic as if you were there, you owe some of your confidence to Lord. The screen that shivered. Film arrived, turning steel and salt into light and sound. Early dramatizations wore the era's manners: upright officers, noble violins, inserts of moral meaning. Then, in 1958, came the British film of Lord's work, precise as good carpentry. In 1997, James Cameron threw open the doors and let spectacle in: spray and steam and jewelry, and a love story big enough to smuggle in a public service announcement about class and lifeboats. People like to argue about romance when disaster is involved. It's a fair argument. But for many, the film did something non-trivial. It returned cold to the story. It made entire audiences pull their coats closer in July. And you may have first learned the outline there: the dome, the band, the tilt, the break. Cinema standardized a myth. Sometimes that irritates historians. Sometimes it helps them keep a door open for the curious. Myths, the honest lies. Myths simplify to survive. They retain the edges that cut clean and sand down the splinters that won't play nice on a classroom poster. Women and children, first, became a headline larger than the messy ledger beneath it. Nearer, my God, to thee, became a single, perfect final chord, not a set list improvised under frost. Unsinkable became hubris in one word, not a marketing hedge, gradually misquoted into arrogance. Are the myths wrong? Not exactly. They are curated. The risk is that curation becomes anesthesia. The antidote is detail: the baker balancing on the stern, the third-class maze, the missed binoculars, the messages cued behind gossip at the wireless. This book you are listening to It is, in its own way, an argument for messy truth. The legal afterlife. The inquiries in Washington and London read like paper plays, witnesses sworn, diagrams unrolled, testimonies crisp as collars. They established the bones of the narrative, but bones do not make a face. Within those hearings sat the fulcrum of modern safety at sea. False comfort was cross-examined and retired. Lifeboat arithmetic was rewritten by grief into math even a politician could not refuse. Outside the hearing rooms, liability hunted for a harbor. Insurance learned to keep an extra pocket for ice. The public learned that corporations could apologize and still exist the next day, which is both practical and hard to accept when your grief is new. Memory that stands upright. Cities raised monuments, angels with salt in their eyes, sailors in bronze gazing at a horizon famous for having no ships in it, lists of names careful as prayer. Schoolchildren traced letters with fingers not yet sized for such loss. Every spring, wreaths. Every year, another speech that tried to avoid the word inevitable and landed on human instead. Families made their own altars, photographs in oval frames, a ring in a dish, a postcard in a drawer that should have been emptied and never was. In kitchens, the story was told so often that it started to creak at the hinges and still refused to open all the way. The wreck as oracle. In 1985, the bow lifted into light, and we added footage to our faith. Down there, it turned out, the ship looked like itself and like nothing we had allowed ourselves to imagine. The grand staircase was gone, but the landing, watched by bronze cherubs, still felt like a pause you could step into. China waited in drifts for meals that would never be called. Shoes pointed at absence. Rusticals ate the ship politely and relentlessly. We argued, preserve, recover, or let sleep. Science asked for data, commerce asked for tickets, reverence asked for distance. Ethics put its elbows on the table and demanded we speak clearly. We didn't. We stammered our way into compromise, document deeply, retrieve sparingly, exhibit respectfully. Sometimes we succeeded. Sometimes we marketed. The ocean, uninterested, continued its work of turning nouns back into elements. Why she visits our century anyway? Why does Titanic feel modern? Because the story holds everything we are still arguing about. Technology versus nature, systems that promised safety, a sea that refused to sign the contract. Class, gates and staircases, access routes and delays, etiquette as accident. Bandwidth, a wireless set that could transmit the world and still miss the one message that mattered at the worst moment. Leadership and labor, a captain's calm, engineer's hot endurance, steward's soft-spoken logistics. Narrative competence, our reflex to render tragedy into a lesson neat enough to sleep on, followed by history's refusal to be neat. If I step out from behind the curtain for one last aside, what is your unsinkable? Which engineered assurances do you trust so completely that you forget their qualifiers? Which elegant spaces persuade you that hazard has been domesticated? Titanic is not wagging a finger. She's placing a hand on your sleeve. Echoes in other skies and seasons. Every time an airliner goes down, an algorithm fails loudly. A city floods because a storm introduces itself by a name no model rehearsed. We quote Titanic without saying her name. We talk about redundancy, drills, whistles in the night. We talk about half-empty lifeboats in new forms, options ignored because etiquette and optimism are cousins. We talk about bands not with violins, but with assurances that keep playing long after the room has begun to tilt. The proper homage is not tears, it is checklists that blush at shortcuts. The museum and the mirror. Walk a traveling exhibition, and you'll see a plate no different from one your grandmother owned. A watch stopped at a time that won't stay put. A postcard whose ink was meant to be small talk and has become scripture. You will also see your own face reflected in the glass. And that is the point. Titanic is a mirror tuned to show you your modernity under different lighting. Children press their noses to the case glass. Some ask about the iceberg as if it were a villain with motives. Some ask about the boats. The best ask about the doors, the literal ones that closed, the figurative ones that weren't imagined, the procedures that became bottlenecks, because good times make lazy maps. Ghosts at polite distances. Walk to a seaside memorial at dusk, and you will notice what loss does to air. It hushes. It teaches waves to stand straighter. Names on bronze grow salt freckles. Someone has left flowers wrapped in supermarket plastic that crackles like a whispered apology. You read a surname and realize that person's grandson or granddaughter is buying coffee somewhere right now, living inside the remainder. The myth is public. The missing chair is private. Both deserve candles. The last lesson that refuses to be last. There is a word I've avoided because it tracks dust, hubris. It's not wrong, but it is incomplete. To blame pride alone is to ignore care, the care of riveters, stewards, engineers, mothers cutting hats, care that broke against the unexpected. Better words might be margin and mercy. Margin, because design must leave room for what you cannot imagine. Mercy, because the living must make room for what the dead can no longer explain. When a ship promises too much, it is our job to ask a few rude questions. When a captain is too calm, it is our job to send more lookouts. When a system plays a tune so confident that we hum along, it is our job to step outside and listen for weather. Curtain call. So here we are, more than a century later, still craning our necks toward a staircase that isn't there, still hearing a violin that may have been a waltz, a hymn, or simply the mind making order in noise. We watch the bow sleep in silt, and we tell ourselves that memory is a kind of salvage, that telling is a way of lifting without theft. If you listen very carefully, you can still hear Belfast's hammers, Southampton's whistles, the band's stubborn chords, the oars creaking like knuckles, the whisper the iceberg made when it traded part of its beard for starboard steel. You can hear the quiet voices on Carpathia, pouring tea and writing names, setting the world back on its tracks, one blanket at a time. And perhaps you can hear beneath all that the oldest sentence the sea knows how to say, be ready. Not because disaster is certain, but because care is the only beautiful superstition. We leave the ship where she lies, patient beneath her winter of water. We step back onto our own decks, offices, kitchens, train platforms, airplane aisles where the lights are warm and the music is soft and the night pretends to be polite. We tighten a buckle. We check the exit we have never used. We count the people we love. Then we go on, as they did, not because we have conquered the sea, but because we have learned to look at it without lying. The sea takes what it takes, but it leaves things, 2 lessons, names, the faint outline of a staircase that isn't there. When the lights went out, the story did not. It surfaced in rules and radios, in lifeboat drills and ice patrols, in the faces on a pier reading chalkboards with hands that couldn't stop shaking. It surfaced again in 1985, 2 miles down, where cameras learned to move softly, and we learned that memory can be mapped, but not possessed. If there's a single sentence the Titanic speaks across a century, it's this: be ready because care is the only beautiful superstition. Build with margin. Question: the elegant promise. Count the people you love before the music starts. Believe in competence, but not as a spell. And when the night tilts, be the hand that steadies someone else's footing. We could end with hubris, the easy word. Instead, let's end with care. Care forged the ship. Care fought the water. Care tuned the violins and lit the boilers. Care rode into the dark. Care poured tea on the Carpathia and wrote names into lists, until lists became lives again. Care is what we owe the past, and what the past demands of our future. So, leave the ship where she lies, patient under her winter of water. Carry what matters: the craftsman's pride, the officer's restraint, the wireless keys tapping courage into the night, the women who would not be ornamental, the oars beating time until a light finally answered. Let the myths keep their music, but hold the details too. They are the screws that keep memory from falling apart. If you found this journey worth your time, share it with someone who still believes history is just dates and disasters. Remind them that history is also breath and bread, blankets and decisions, a staircase and a sky full of indifferent stars. And if you return to this story later, as we all do, come back, not for the sinking, but for the warning, the competence, the kindness. We step ashore now. The night is behind us. The mirror is not. Walk carefully. Ask better questions. Leave room for the unexpected. And when you hear someone whisper, "Unsinkable," smile gently and reach for the lifebelt. Chapter 1: Morning Names on a Moving Street. Southampton wakes to the smell of coal and salt, to gulls scribing white commas across a pewter sky. Carts rattle. Tickets tear. You can hear a ship's heartbeat before you ever see it, a slow percussion of winches and hoists, hawsers groaning like old violins. At the end of the quay stands the newest promise of the age, black-sided and bright-eyed, RMS Titanic. Before any iceberg, there are only names at a gangway. A millionaire lifts his hat with unstudied elegance. A seamstress fusses the ribbon on her sister's bonnet. A governess counts her 2 boys as if numbers were a kind of armor. A coal trimmer, hands forever marked by the dark turns once, to wave at no one in particular, embarrassed by tenderness. A baker passes with a faint perfume of yeast and clean linen. A wireless operator hums a tune because the future hums inside his head and won't be quiet. If you were there, whose face would you follow with your eyes? The confident, the weary. Be honest. Our curiosities reveal our ethics. They file aboard into a city that moves stairs polished like vows, carpets tuned to soften footsteps, engines sleeping like tigers behind polite doors. The ship receives them all without comment. That is a city's job. Chapter 2: The Captain and the Company He Keeps. Edward John Smith carries calm the way other men carry watches, reliable, weighty, checked without fuss. Nearing retirement, he looks on the bridge as if the horizon were an old colleague. You could set your breathing by his. Very well. Behind him, the officers stack competence like bricks. William Murdoch, precise enough to make a pencil feel redundant. Charles Lightoller, salt in his voice and a spine of oak. They run the wheelhouse like a monastery of quietly moving parts, murmured bearings, a folded chart's dry whisper. The engine room telegraph answering with obedient clangs. On a ship like this, hierarchy is choreography. The boatswain's call is a bird cry that knits the deck into order. Quartermasters touch the wheel with a pianist's economy. Stewards rehearse 1,000 small salvations, the found glove, the settled stomach, the room that feels like belonging. Competence, not drama, is the most persuasive music a ship plays. Are you prone to tragedy's glamour? Pause here. Admire the ordinary. It is bigger than it looks. Chapter 3. The designer who walks with a notebook. If a ship has a conscience, sometimes it wears a pencil behind its ear. Thomas Andrews, chief designer from Harland & Wolff, walks his creation as a man might check in on a grandchild, proud, exacting, full of unshowy love. He runs his hand along a balustrade to feel for a snag, invisible to the eye. He asks a stewardess whether a latch sits true and remembers her answer. He corrects, not to scold but to finish the promise. He knows the ship's bones bulkheads like castle walls, watertight doors that hum shut with electric manners. He also knows the compromises, beauty bargains with safety, in small, persuasive coins. No villainy, only 1,000 sensible decisions made in rooms where architects and accountants speak the same language a little too fluently. Andrews will spend the voyage teaching strangers to wear life jackets inside out so the buoyant capote keeps faces above water. Even on a day full of sunlight, he narrates safety like a bedtime story. It's a nice paradox. The quiet men often write the loudest chapters. Chapter 4. The band that kept time when time wouldn't. On most afternoons, music is interior weather. Wallace Hartley leads his small orchestra through waltz that persuades soup not to tremble. He knows which corner of the dining saloon turns a violin into velvet and which makes it thin as wire. His players trade nods that mean there, and the room settles into civility. Later, when Knight asks for bravery, they will answer without speeches, just tuning pegs and discipline, hands numbing to frost, melodies offered like warm coats to strangers. Perhaps they played Autumn, perhaps a hymn. Memory loves a tidy title. Truth loves usefulness. What matters is this: until physics ended the song, the band held chaos at a respectful distance. Before that night, though, they are simply men at work, tasting the air before choosing the tempo. Hartley writes home that the ship is splendid. He is right, and the adjective will soon be asked to carry too much. Chapter 5. The keys that talked to the shore. Wireless has its own stars, dots and dashes blinking invisibly across a black Atlantic. Jack Phillips and Harold Bride wear the future over their ears like crowns made of rubber and wire. Messages tumble in business arrangements, dinner invitations, someone on shore confirming they miss someone at sea. The operators translate the world into electricity and back again, the way a heart translates oxygen into decision. When ice reports begin, they tap those too. Coordinates, penciled on a chart. Warnings in tidy letters. A long, precise list from the Mesaba. An urgent call from the Californian. The room hums. Priorities crowd the door. They work. Not carelessly, hungrily. The line makes money on passenger traffic. The operators keep pace. Later, history will scold their triage. Tonight, they are young men doing a hard, brand-new job brilliantly, until brilliance must yield to catastrophe. Bride will leave the ship with feet so cold they forget his name. Phillips will keep tapping until there is nothing left to tell. Remember that when you hear the comfortable jangle of hindsight. Chapter 6. Women who refuse to be ornaments. Margaret Brown, you know the nickname history insists on, but let's use her name, steps aboard with a laugh that the carpet tries, and fails, to muffle. She notices people for a living, which is to say she's dangerous to indifference. When a woman freezes at the edge of a lifeboat, Brown's voice becomes a bridge. When blankets are short, she becomes a quartermaster of wool and sense. On the Carpathia, she will turn grief into logistics. Rooms found, clothes traded, a fund raised before the ink on the passenger lists is dry. Violet Jessup, a stewardess and trained nurse, practices the invisible craft of calm. The tray that does not rattle, the child who agrees that bed is a place you go on purpose. She has already survived the Olympics collision. She will survive the Titanic and later the Britannic. If superstition were a person, it would try very hard to avoid her. But competence is its own talisman. Names like Lucille Duff Gordon, Lady Duff Gordon in the papers, complicate the ledger. Her boat left half full. Her conscience was fuller than rumor allowed. The night will not separate saints from sinners cleanly. It never does. What it will reveal is who turned toward other people's fear and who turned away. Chapter 7. Third Class, First Hopes. Down a deck or three, the light is different. Clean whitewash, long tables, the smell of bread. Third class is not squalor here. It is thrift with dignity. Voices braid, Irish, Scandinavian, Italian, a dozen dialects holding the same sentence. America in different mouths. Babies test salt on their tongues. A fiddle turns the dining room into Saturday, even when the calendar disagrees. Here walks Annie Moore in memory, the first immigrant through Ellis Island, a generation before, and beside her, the Addergool 14, in fact villagers from County Mayo who boarded with the confidence of neighbors. Some would not return. Here a young man carries tool used hands, and a ring still warm from his pocket. Here a mother ties a shawl tighter and counts 3 small heads until numbers become lullabies. There is a map of the ship. They do not receive the quickest doors, the permission stairs. Some stewards will shepherd them up. Some barriers will fumble their keys. Yet the courage is evenly distributed. We like to say the sea is democratic. Ships are not. People try to be. Chapter 8. Married Names Written in Stone. Ida and Isidore Strauss appear as a whisper at first department store royalty. Yes, but smaller than the myth. When invited into a boat, Ida refuses. We have lived together for many years. Where you go, I go. He, a gentleman by habit and conviction, will not climb in while others stand waiting. She will not climb in without him. They sit side by side on deck chairs that have no business being brave, and wait for a world to end according to their marriage's grammar. Benjamin Guggenheim changes into evening dress and tells a steward, "We've dressed up in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." We should not glamorize a sentence that masks a wound, but we can record it. He helps women into boats, then steps back out of history as smoothly as he entered it. John Jacob Astor sees his young wife away. The most expensive man on the Atlantic remains where money stops at the rail. Madeleine survives. On a list, it looks like arithmetic. In a life, it looks like winter. These are the names you find on plaques, the vowels polished by fingers. Touch them once if you ever stand in front of the bronze. You are not asking for permission to mourn, only admitting you borrowed some courage for a minute. Chapter 9. Hands in Heat, the Engineers and the Firemen. In rooms no passenger will ever tour, Chief Engineer Joseph Bell and his men shepherd steam the way a priest shepherds hope, without impatience, without applause. When water finds them, they do not run. They keep the pumps alive because minutes are currency, and upstairs people are still spending them lowering boats, writing names, sending signals. The temperature is cruel, the footing untrustworthy, the noise a theology. They work until physics ends the argument. In the stokeholds, firemen and trimmers shovel with choreography, 10 strokes a minute, then 20, the difference between enough and not yet. Some will reach boats, many will not. Their heroism fills no diaries and writes no notes to wives from hotel paper on the other side. It is recorded only in the stubborn rumor that lights burned until almost the last. Believe that rumor. It honors the unseen. Chapter 10. The Watchman and the Wheel. Up in the cold, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee scan a moonless night. The sea is a black window. The stars look close enough to pocket. No binoculars by accident, not design. They do what lookouts have always done. Trust eyes, trust habit, trust the ship to answer the bell. When the horizon misbehaves, Fleet rings 3 times and calls the bridge. The sentence is simple. Iceberg, right ahead. History pivots on 5 syllables. On the bridge, Murdoch throws the helm over and orders the engines astern. You want cinematic violence. The collision is quieter, a long hiss, as steel remembers it used to be ore. 6 compartments begin to fill. The math sulks, then turns on them. Lighthauler will organize starboard boats with the purist's ear for the phrase, women and children first. Women and children, to him, means only. He is not wrong, perhaps. He is not gentle, perhaps. 5th Officer Lowe will later turn his boat back toward the cries, a choice that will haunt him even as it saves a handful. There is almost never a single brave way, only a way you can live with. Chapter 11. The Baker, the Boys with the Key, and the Stories We Argue. The night likes ironies. Charles Juffin, Chief Baker, works until the last, throwing deck chairs over to floaters because practical minds make rafts out of furniture. He enters the sea and, by luck and a warm belly, survives longer than science permits. He climbs onto an overturned collapsible and tells the story later with no romance, which makes it feel truer. 2 small boys, the Navratil brothers, are placed into a boat by a father who will not join them. Later, in New York, a newspaper calls them the Titanic orphans, and photographers aim kindly. Their mother, in France, recognizes their faces in print and sails across an ocean not to immigrate, but to retrieve her sons from a legend. Edith Rosenbaum, a fashion reporter, carries a musical pig toy that squeaks a cheerful song. She uses it to calm children in the boat until Dawn thinks about existing. Harold Lowe, the officer who rowed back, gathers a small flotilla and makes decisions you should not measure in warmth alone. Lighthauler rides a final breath of air out the mouth of a funnel and surfaces to a night that will insist he live long enough to testify. People argue, what if? As if the past were a whiteboard. The night had already chosen its palette. Cold haste, margin shaved too thin. Better to honor the human scale of decisions made at 4 degrees above freezing. Chapter 12. the ship that kept their names. The Carpathia arrives with lamps strung like a ladder stitched into the dark, and Captain Arthur Rostron runs toward danger with a sailor's theology: prayer first, then orders, then tea. Survivors come up in nets and on rope ladders, hands chafed, eyes too bright. The deck becomes a republic of blankets. Margaret Brown goes back to work. A doctor counts pulses, a purser counts names, a wireless operator writes the world a telegram it will read with shaking hands. New York meets them with rain that hides tears and chalkboards that refuse to spell everyone. Later, inquiries stack testimony into mosaics, and film turns memory into light. Decades pass. In 1985, cameras descend and find the bow lying quiet as a cathedral roof rust eating it gently, shoes still pointing toward feet the ocean has erased. We argue salvage and sanctity. We count rivets and miracles. We look for villains and find, mostly, people. If you need a single sentence to carry away, let it be mild. Care is the only beautiful superstition. The people who boarded that moving city brought it with them in trays and charts, in lullabies and engines, in lifeboats and lists, and the precise way a steward said, "This way, please." The night was larger than their care. But their care is why we can tell the story without lying. Epilogue, a quiet roll call. Close your eyes and stand on the boat deck before any alarm. Hear the low shiver of the ship's breath. Smell beeswax, bread, the faint medicinal note of fresh paint. People pass you on their way to dinner, or letters, or a book borrowed from the library, a captain's calm, an engineer's smudge, a violinist's careful hands, a baker's laugh, a stewardess's steady eyes, a boy's cap too big. Say their names if you know them. If you don't, say someone. The word fits more than you think. Now, let the city move on under your feet. The sea is patient, the stars are impolite, and history, even when it breaks your heart, is only asking this, that you remember the people, not just the ship. The harbor was still asleep when the ship woke up. Dawn moved across Southampton like a slow hand over velvet, and the first thing it touched was steel ribs and plates, rivets that glimmered like frost. At the quay, gulls turned figure eights through a sky the color of pewter. A scent of coal dust and brine lived in the wind. And then the whistles sounded deep, confident, indifferent as a cathedral bell, and people came as if called to prayer. Maeve stood among them, a small suitcase gripped in both hands. Her coat was too thin for the morning and too hopeful for the world. It had a narrow waist and careful seams, the kind you sew for yourself when coins are counted loud and dreams are counted soft. She'd stitched the inner pocket for her papers, a scrap of lace from her mother, and a photograph that made everyone look too serious for the happiness they were trying to hold still within it. Not far from her, a boy no older than 19, Tom, a coal trimmer, who could lift 2 sacks at once and made jokes only when nobody important was looking, leaned on his bicycle and stared at the ship with a face that couldn't decide whether to grin or salute. The Titanic's hull dwarfed him, dwarfed the quay, dwarfed the other ships like an oldest child noticing how much taller his shadow had grown. Tom wasn't sailing as a passenger. He was going inside the ship the way a heartbeat goes inside a chest. For the rest of his life, rooms would smell like coal to him, and he would remember the way the ocean kept a second rhythm under the one that belonged to men. Up on the promenade deck, Eleanor Whitby, widow, philanthropist, survivor of social seasons and the particular kindness of gossips, rested both hands on a polished rail and watched the gangways swarm. She wore black, not out of grief alone. Though grief was an ocean with its own weather, she wore it because she had preferred the truth of that color, since deciding at 35 that she could shape her life as cleanly as a silhouette. Now nearly 50, she had the look of a person who had lost names but kept the stories. The ship stretched behind and ahead, rooms stacked like chapters, corridors like sentences too elegant to end. Inside, stewards set out silver and clean napery, flowers arranged with a precision that made them seem almost natural. A violinist tuned in a stairwell, found his A, nodded to himself with a private smile. In the Marconi room, the wireless set, a polished creature with nerves of copper, waited for the tap, tap, tap that would thread sound into letters, and letters into wants, reservations, trivialities, ice reports that hummed along the air like bees stitched into invisible seams. They boarded, all of them, with different steps. Maeve glanced back once. The harbor was already a memory she could see through. Tom slung his jacket over one shoulder and descended to the guts of the ship, where boilers squatted like iron animals and men's lungs wrote soot poems in the air. Eleanor walked as if into an opera house, calm, as if modernity were a performance in which she had a box seat and the right to leave during the second act. When the lines fell away and the ship eased itself into the channel, the city did not diminish. It simply grew watercolor soft. Still, a hush traveled through the decks, a collective inhalation, when the ship turned her broad face toward open water, and daylight opened its hand over them completely. Maeve pressed her fingers to the rail and whispered hello to the Atlantic, the way you whisper to a child or a dog you hope will like you. Where does a story begin? With the idea of it, probably. Long before her paint dried, Titanic had been told to herself in the minds of men who wanted to weld certainty to water. Unsinkable, they said. Unsinkable, as though the ocean were a floor and the ship a table you could move without lifting the tablecloth. She had been born from rivalry and pride, spun from calculations and ledger lines, built by riveters who wiped sweat with bandages the same color as rust. She was a promise hammered into shape, and promises, as we know, have a way of asking to be kept. The first night, the dining saloon looked like a dream about a hotel that had fallen in love with a palace. Eleanor sat beneath a cascade of electric light and spoke softly with a French couple who wanted to know whether New York smelled like cigarettes. "Oh, everything smells like something," she said dryly. "But after a while, we simply call it air." Her laugh made even the waiters smile. People noticed her because she had the serenity of a person who can afford boredom and chooses not to. Maeve ate in third class, where the tables were long and laughter traveled as easily as stories. The stew tasted of time and patience. The bread was fresh enough to be kind to the teeth, and a man with hands like shovels told a joke about a policeman, a priest, and a violin. The violinist himself, a second-class passenger named Mr. Dawes, traveling to take up a post in a new orchestra, sat nearby, and his laugh had a musician's lilt, breaking into scales even when no tune was intended. Below, Tom learned the sound of a ship that size, not just the engines, not just the churn of the screws, but the conversation between all the parts, the clanks and the purrs, the impatient hiss of steam, the dignified complaint of the hull meeting waves and deciding every moment not to argue. He learned to time his breath, between shovelfuls, to read the language of heat, to find the clean edge of exhaustion where you could balance without falling. On the second day, the sea lay down like a mirror and showed the ship herself. Gulls veered and called, and then were gone, bored perhaps by a boat that did not tilt to their liking. Children ran the length of promenades with the clatter of small shoes that makes all mothers turn, even those whose own children had grown. Eleanor took a book onto the deck, read nothing, and watched everything. At her elbow, a steward appeared with a blanket and a question in his eyes. "Thank you," she said, and when he laid the blanket across her knees, her smile flared. It was a beautiful courtesy, and beauty deserved to be acknowledged as seriously as grief. Maeve found the library in third class, a room of unexpected quiet and mercy, with shelves that smelled like wood shavings and Saturday afternoons. She traced the spines with one finger as if reading in Braille, and chose a book about the American West that could not decide if it was a hymn or a cautionary tale. She did not think about the factory, or the last winter, or the man who had once called her brave, as though he were naming a storm after her. She turned pages and saw dust that glowed like gold when a horse's hooves disturbed it, and she thought she might make dresses that looked like that light. Why not? America had the sort of vowels that made you want to open your mouth wider when you said it. At night, the band played. Mr. Dawes stood at a respectful distance and listened, as musicians sometimes do, with his eyelids lowered and his hands lined up like notes themselves. People danced because there was floor enough for it, and why not? The ocean was huge and beneath them, but for a little while, it felt as though they were on a different ocean entirely, the small sea we cross to meet one another. Eleanor allowed herself one waltz, and did not pretend to be younger than she was. Instead, she danced with the grace of a person who knows exactly how long a minute lasts, and makes it expand to fit a life inside. On the third day, the air sharpened. The horizon whitened in places, as if the sky had been scraped with a little knife. In the Marconi room, messages skittered in. Tap. Tap, tap. Ice reported lat 42 degrees non, lawn 49 degrees W. Tap, tap. Pack ice. Bergs. The operator wrote them down on little slips, like butterflies pinned for study. He brought them to the bridge. The officers read them, nodded, and put them away, like men filing winter with the summer shirts. Faster, perhaps, the water was still. The ship wore her speed like a new hat. Do you see how easily admiration becomes anthem? How confidence can be polished until it becomes godlike? The ship forged on, her wake combed the sea into neatness, and the sun behaved like a guest who knew to leave before midnight. Somewhere out there were white teeth that never needed food, white mountains that did not belong to cartographers. But on board, ladies and gentlemen considered the soup. Maeve wrote a postcard she could not yet send. Dear Bridie, I have stood on the deck and felt the wind cut my cheeks like apples, and it was beautiful. The ship is like a city that believes in itself. I have eaten meat every day, and I do not think about the price of coal here because none of us pay it, except with our breath. She put the card inside the book, about the West, as if the words could marinate in someone else's landscape. Tom finished a shift that felt as long as a season and went up for a sliver of sky. The cold met him with a clean slap. He breathed in and out so deeply the air burned just a bit, the way cold air burns when it's good for you. The night was clear and enormous. Stars littered it like broken glass. He thought of the story his mother told, about sailors steering by lights that never burned out. He would tell her, when he came back, that the lights were so many he felt certain of his direction even when he closed his eyes. Near midnight on April 14, the ocean stopped moving. That's not true, of course. Water is never still. But to the feet of the ship, it felt as if the sea had become a tabletop, and the sky so clean it seemed to ring when looked at too hard. On the bridge, a man lifted binoculars and saw only distance. No moon to lay its syrup over the black, no ripples to gild the teeth of ice. At 11:40 p.m. The lookout saw something not moving that, nonetheless, approached. It grew the way a nightmare grows without obeying perspective. A bell rang. 3 peals. Like the start of a holiday. Then a voice on the telephone, words too crisp for the fear they carried. Iceberg right ahead. The ship moved as a big thing moves when asked to be small. The wheel spun. The engines hesitated forward. Stop. Astern the sea made a sound like silk tearing, and the berg brushed steel. You know this part. History keeps it like a coin in a special pocket. The damage did not look like a wound, it looked like a decision. Plates, riveted with certainty, had unbuttoned along their neat seams. 5 compartments made themselves available to the Atlantic. She could survive 4. 5 was a lesson even this ship could not refuse to learn. The ship shuddered and then calmed, like a horse reminded of the bit. People woke without knowing why. A book slid half an inch on a table and stopped. A glass tilted and decided against it. In third class, pipes clinked. In the boiler rooms, water came with the confidence of something vast and habitual. Tom saw it climbing uneven stairs and thought, incongruously, of rats that housewives describe with an inch of thumb and forefinger. Only this big, they say, and everyone nods and knows better. On the promenade, the air held a taste like tin. The stars watched, as if the show were finally interesting. Officers walked with briskness that scratched at the surface of calm and made a noise like flint. The Marconi key began its dance. CQD, SOS, come at once. We have struck iceberg. Position, tap. Tap, tap, tap. Letters leaped into the night like the truest birds, traveling farther than anyone's voice. Maeve found her way to the open deck among a crowd made of every kind of person, shivering with a unanimity that made class disappear at the edges. A steward said, "Life jackets on, miss." And she took the cork-stuffed thing into her arms as if it were a child, and then let it become a garment. Her fingers would not obey the buckles. A woman with red gloves. Where did she come from? Those beautiful, absurd gloves. Did the buckles for her? And Maeve found herself saying thank you with an intensity that made it more like a promise. Just a precaution, someone said. Because language likes to help when it can't. Merely a drill, another voice said, because practice and reality once held hands in happier stories. Boats swung out like eyebrows in surprise. Sailors assigned numbers to fear. Women and children. Lower away. The ropes complained they had slept through the age of steam and woke to the age of lifeboats. Mr. Dawes, the reader and the listener, had his violin case under his arm. He had brought it because you bring your instrument the way a carpenter brings his hands. Later, he would play, and the sound would give the air a place to stand. Eleanor stood at the rail, her eyes dry in the cold. She had known winters. She had known summers that pretended to be kind. She could see what the officers could not say. She saw the angle of the deck reveal itself by degrees, the small silver of panic in a boy's throat when he remembered that his mother was below with the trunk that contained his presentable shoes. Power is a coat that fits only sometimes. Eleanor put her hands on Maeve's shoulders and turned her toward a boat. "Go," she said, with the voice that once made caterers perform miracles with menus. "There will be other stages for bravery. Choose this one for living." Her black dress made her look like the night itself, insisting on a point. "But," Maeve began, "because we always begin with, but when we mean, and." "Go," Eleanor repeated, more gently, because gentleness is a door even terror will pass through. "There is someone in America who is waiting for you, even if you do not yet know their name." Maeve was passed into the boat by hands she never saw whose. Someone settled her on a bench pressed with frost. The ropes creaked. "Lower," a voice called, and down they went, the ship rising over them as if it were a building lifting to let them pass. Tom was still below. He and the others were resting with the leaks, the way farm boys wrestle with calves, all muscle, all stubbornness, all ridiculous hope. They pumped, they closed, they opened, they cursed, they prayed with their sleeves rolled above their elbows, because prayer, like water, is practical in certain quantities. "Up," someone shouted, a word that sounded like permission. He went. Above, the band started to play. It wasn't the hymn yet, it was cheerful music, the kind that says, "Look, we are still in the ordinary world and see how orderly it is." A waltz, a rag, something with a bounce. Mr. Dawes stood at the edge of the circle and added his bow to the weave. The notes were small fires, lit against an enormous night, but fires nonetheless. In the lifeboat, Maeve did not cry yet. The oars dug, and the sea made a thin sound against the wood that no one at the ship could hear. The cold was not a temperature, it was a law. She set her jaw and breathed through it like someone in labor. The boat drifted farther, and the ship grew taller, and the band's music moved across water like the faint smell of bread. She could see figures moving along the rail, tiny and precise as a paper theater. She looked for the woman with red gloves, and thought perhaps she had imagined her. Later, there would be so many versions of kindness that memory could not organize them. Eleanor stood with a group of women who had decided that going quietly was a form of art. She refused the boat she had helped fill. She refused the next, and the next. She did not perform drama, she simply stayed, as if loyalty to the ship were a way of being loyal to herself. Officer words passed by her like birds in migration. She did not hold them, she did not argue with them, she let them go. When a young man tried to show her the correct method for tying a lifebelt, she smiled and learned, because learning is the only ceremony that honors time. Tom emerged into air that sliced. He half ran, half slipped, caught himself on a bit, and laughed because laughter felt like something he could still own. He found a boat crowded beyond reason, clung to the davit line with the kind of grip that bruises on both sides. Then someone said they needed more men to row, and he stepped into the world outside of orders, the world where you choose yourself. "I can," he said, and a hand grabbed his collar and hauled him into the boat like a sack of flour that had shouted poetry. Down the boats went, 1, 2, then the numbers lost count and became prayers. The ship lifted. Her deck became a hill. The hill became a slope. The slope became a decision no one could amend. The band played the hymn. You hear it in every telling, and you think sentimental, apocryphal, contested, true. But listen. The night is full of cold and wires and math. A hymn is not about facts. A hymn is a rope. Nearer. They played, and the violin sounded like glass, thinking about light. A man wept quietly, with his face turned toward the stars, so the tears would dry on his cheekbones and not trouble anyone. Eleanor closed her eyes and stood very still in black silk, and felt absolutely present for the first time in years. She pressed her palm to the polished rail with a gesture that was both farewell and gratitude. It had been a beautiful ship. There is no shame in naming beauty, even when it breaks. The final angle of the bow lifted like the arm of someone trying to hail a carriage in a city where carriages had never been. From the boats, the people watched something that would later be described with words that tried to be simple and fell into awe. There was a great noise, and then no noise. There were lights, and then no lights. The ship broke her back and knelt briefly to the idea of herself. And then she was gone, her name swallowed, and only the air saying it back for a second Titanic before the word belonged to history alone. The sea closed over what the sea had decided to borrow. The night wore the same sky it had started with, like a host who refuses to change clothes after disaster because dignity is a uniform. The boats rocked. The water made its small, unarguable sounds. People spoke less and listened more. Crying traveled across the surface like a low wind. There were stars. Have I told you there were stars? They were so precise, they seemed almost honest. People looked up because up was the only place that did not hurt. Maeve kept her arms wrapped around the life jacket because she had nothing else to hold. Cork rubbed her chin and smelled like old bark. She felt the ache of what she did not know and the weight of what she did. Her fingers could not quite remember being warm. Tom rowed. He rowed like a man who had swung a shovel against a furnace and argued with heat and learned its rules. The oarlock creaked rhythm into him, and the rhythm kept him from thinking too much. A baby cried and then slept because the body is sometimes merciful to itself. Around 4 in the morning, lights appeared where there had been none. At first, they seemed like another trick. Then they persisted. The Carpathia sounded her whistle, a courteous sound in a rude world, and the boats found themselves heading toward a shape that meant heat and tea and blankets and lists and crowded decks and stories that would need telling and retelling until they were solid enough to live beside. Ladders dropped. Nets dropped. Hands reached. People climbed out of open mouths of boats into the throat of rescue, and the Carpathia, smaller than the ship she could not save but heroic in proportion to what she had chosen, became land. Maeve's feet found the deck and could not quite believe it. A woman pressed a mug into her hands, and the mug was so hot it made her cry, because feeling returned is its own kind of pain. "Drink," the woman said, and Maeve drank, and the tea told her with every swallow that the world had not ended everywhere. In a corner, Mr. Dawes held his violin case like a reliquary. He opened it and looked at the instrument, not to play but to check that it was still what it had always been: wood, strings, the possibility of voice. Tom sat on a coil of rope and stared at his hands. They looked like someone else's hands, the way hands look after you've done work your grandfather will dream about years after you're gone. A sailor pressed a blanket around his shoulders and then, ridiculously, an orange into his palm. Tom laughed at the orange, peeled it with shaking fingers, and the scent sunlight preserved made him believe again in countries. Eleanor came aboard last, among the three of them. She had made it into a boat she had not intended to take. Autobiography is full of such reluctant edits. The Carpathia's doctor checked her pulse, asked questions in a voice that had learned to be careful with the edges of shock. "I'll be all right," she told him, as if he needed to bring that information to someone who was worried on her behalf. Later, she would help distribute blankets. She would write names. She would compose letters for those whose grammar collapsed beneath grief. She would remember the woman with red gloves, if only to ask herself after whether kindness isn't sometimes the only bright color permitted on a dark night. At daybreak, the water showed a few floating sentences, chairs, a door, a hat that did not look like failure until you knew who had worn it. The sea did not change color to acknowledge what it had taken. The sea is honest that way. The Carpathia turned toward New York and became a city of its own, full of widows and orphans who had not been such the day before, full of men who could not stop hearing the sound of oars and the silence after the sound of a large thing is removed from the world. On board, lives began to reassemble themselves like furniture after a move. They would never fit exactly as before. There would always be a drawer that stuck. Maeve found a corner and wrote, because words were an act, like breathing, that did not ask permission. "Dear Bridie, I have something to tell you that is so much larger than what a postcard can hold that I will have to bring the telling to you myself." She did not know if she would send it. She needed the writing to make the future occur in ink. Tom slept in a manner that seemed to argue with sleep. Sometimes he sat up sweating, and sometimes he laughed, a small, wild sound, at nothing anyone else could see. A priest passed, touched his shoulder, and did not linger because some burdens you acknowledge by not pressing them. Later, Tom would keep the orange peel folded inside his pocket for a long time, as if it were a map. Eleanor found the ship's rail, the Carpathia's rail now, and stood at it in the morning. She watched the wake write its white sentence behind them, and for the first time since the night she cried. It was not a dramatic crying. It was a crying that tidied as it went, placing tears where they belonged, washing corners. Grief, she realized, is a kind of housekeeping. Joy is the visitor with muddy boots. She smiled at the thought and pressed her gloved hand flat to the wood. She would go home. She would sell a necklace that had felt like a story and turn it into bread and coal and school books with names stitched inside. She would take the precise, terrible arithmetic of what a ship can carry and convert it into an arithmetic for the living. And then New York. Docks and whistles and journalists with faces already rehearsed into sympathy. The city threw itself toward the ship with the rude grace of someone tripping in a hurry and pretending it was dancing. On the pier, people held flowers and signs and questions. Names were shouted. Names were whispered. Names were found and lost and found again. A man wept into his hat. A girl stood on a crate to see better and saw less. Maeve stepped onto the pier, and in that moment became a person who had once crossed an ocean and survived. A policeman asked her name, wrote it down in a careful hand, and she spelled it again because vowels are headstrong creatures in new countries. She thought of the dresses she would sew for American women, and how much their lives might be altered by seams. Not much, perhaps, but enough. A good hem is a promise. Tom, guided by a charitable hand and stubborn legs, walked down a ramp and into a future he had not memorized. He would write to his mother, yes. He would explain coal and cold and the way the stars seemed to press their tiny hands against his face until he believed something again. He would forget some things because forgetting is not betrayal. It is an organ that allows us to digest sorrow. He would remember that orange peel in his pocket and the way the sea made room for a boat even when it had not made room for a ship. Eleanor found a carriage and then refused it and then accepted it because dignity sometimes wears the clothes of practicality. She gave her address to a man who knew his horses by smell. Over her shoulder, she took one last look at the ship that had become a harbor for a different kind of arrival. Good, she said out loud, though she did not know to whom. Good. It was a benediction and an instruction. Years slip by the way. Gulls slip along wind. The wreck sank into its own darkness, learned the language of pressure, grew a coat of cold that did not fit any human's shoulders. People argued about notes and orders and boasts and blame, as if reshaping an old night could lengthen dawn. They built more ships and gave them names with careful vowels. They drilled. They counted lifeboats with an arithmetic newly literate. Maeve never forgot the way the violin had sounded like glass. In a city of subways and sugar, she opened a small shop where the lights were always warm even when snow fussed at the windows. She stood a bolt of fabric upright and leaned her cheek against it like a person leaning against a door to hear the party within. She married, perhaps, or perhaps she did not. That part is not necessary to the truth. She spoke softly to girls who came in with shoulders hunched from work, and she fitted them, and sometimes they left with a feeling that their lives might cling to them more kindly. Tom worked on ships longer than he meant to, and then less, and then he worked on things that did not move at all. Buildings that wanted roofs, engines that asked for oil, and promised not to die at sea. He told stories in pubs and then stopped because stories are a kind of salt and can dry the mouth. He kept a small tin on a mantelpiece where he put objects that did not obey any category: a key with no door, a train ticket never punched, a curl of a woman's hair given with a laugh that survived the loss of a name, a brown scrap that any child might throw away, not leather, not paper. Orange peel. Hard as a fossil. He would take it out sometimes and hold it to his nose, and sometimes there would be the ghost of summer. Eleanor became one of those women who could enter a room and cause people to put down their arguments and lift up their pens. She signed things, checks and petitions, and the occasional note that said simply, "Enough." When men stood to speak about heroes and industry, she stayed seated and looked at them as if she were adding a column of figures. Sometimes she was. When she died, the letters in her desk showed that kindness had indeed been a color she returned to again and again. There were receipts for coal, yes. There were also paid tuition bills with names in schoolboy loops. There was a single photograph of a violinist whose name she'd never learned, taken on a bright afternoon before a dark night. If you go to the sea now, and you should, even if you do not think you have a reason, stand where the horizon looks like the straightest thing ever invented, and breathe. The air is older than history, but never old-fashioned. Think of steel plates and lace pockets and oranges and gloves so red they could almost be warm by themselves. Think of a ship that was not given permission to be perfect. Think of men with blackened hands and women with black sleeves and songs that turn fear into something singable. Stories move across time the way boats move across water, sometimes cleanly, sometimes at the mercy of weather. We write them to reach shore. We write them to stay afloat. We write them because at midnight, when a ship meets ice, language may be one of the few things that learns how to row. And if you listen properly, not with impatient ears, but with the kind that sit very still and offer tea, you might hear it. Not the hymn alone, not the sacred panic of violin against air, but the other music, the quiet one. The one that begins when a hand finds another hand at the edge of a boat and squeezes. It is the sound of the living becoming a chorus. It is the sound of a city in the morning, and coal dust and brine, and dawn moving across steel. It is the sound of a ship waking, and of steps boarding, and of a world believing in itself, even after the ocean has reminded it to be humble. Once, a girl with a thin coat put her fingers on a rail and whispered hello to the Atlantic. The ocean does not remember our names. But sometimes, when the light is right and the gulls draw their figure eights and a whistle sounds as indifferent as any bell, the ocean remembers our stories. That is enough. That is a kind of rescue. That is how we arrive.